From economic pressure to direct military action, America is boldly recalibrating its foreign policy playbook.
It really seems that way.
This week, we've definitely witnessed some decisive moves signaling a significant shift in how the U.S. approaches its national security and how it asserts its global strength.
That's absolutely right. We saw President Trump announce the strategic relocation of U.S. Space Command, moving it from Colorado to Huntsville, Alabama.
And he was pretty direct about why.
Oh, very clear. He cited concerns over Colorado's mail-in voting system as a big factor, even saying Democrats cheat. And then he promised this huge economic boost for Alabama. What was it? 30,000 jobs, billions in investment.
Yeah, billions. It's a powerful statement, deploying strategic assets like that.
Definitely. And then almost at the same time, you had the White House confirming a U.S. military strike down in the Southern Caribbean.
Right. And this wasn't just, a routine operation. It was against a drug-laden vessel coming from Venezuela. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called it a lethal strike.
A lethal strike, against a designated narco-terrorist organization. They linked to the Tren de Aragua cartel. Pretty strong language.
A report said 11 terrorists killed in action. No U.S. casualties.
Which brings us to the core issue, really. These actions, they feel very different from the traditional foreign policy tools we're used to hearing about. It forces us to ask, are things like economic sanctions still enough? Are they adequate against today's threats?
Or is this more direct, maybe more assertive approach becoming the necessary standard for protecting American interests, projecting strength?
It's a fundamental question.
Yeah.
And that's what our deep dive is all about today.
Absolutely. So our mission, yours and mine, is to cut through the noise here and really try to understand America's evolving foreign policy. We're going to look at the historical reliance and the current use of economic sanctions.
Right, and then pivot to these more recent, very direct, very assertive actions under the Trump administration.
And to do that, we've got some key sources.
Yeah, our sources are crucial for this. We're drawing insights from a white paper focused on the effectiveness of economic sanctions. It was published with the George W. Bush Institute. And we're pairing that with recent news reports detailing these specific actions by the Trump administration.
So the goal is really to shed light on how America is projecting power, how it's addressing threats in a world that, frankly, seems to demand pretty decisive leadership these days.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start with sanctions. How did they become such a, go-to tool in U.S. foreign policy? Historically, they're often described as sitting somewhere between military action and diplomacy.
That's the classic description. Seen as convenient, maybe low risk and low cost, at least compared to putting boots on the ground. But yeah, the effectiveness question is key.
How did it evolve? Where did it start?
Well, you had early precursors, like the Embargo Act of 1807, restricting trade. But the really big one initially was the Trading with the Enemy Act, TWEA, back in 1917.
Okay, TWEA. And that was originally just for wartime, right? To cut off enemies.
Yeah. Exactly. Designed to stop enemies from accessing U.S. resources during conflict. But then its powers just expanded hugely, especially during the Cold War.
Ah, the Cold War. And that's where it really took off.
That's where it became a much broader tool. Under 2WA, presidents suddenly had this massive power to regulate the global economy. They could block financial transactions, seize assets, impose these sweeping trade measures, particularly against the Soviet Union.
Wow. And for a long time, these powers didn't have many checks on them.
Not really, no. For a good stretch, presidents could wield these broad economic restrictions just by declaring a national emergency. It's a pretty unchecked power.
Okay, so eventually Congress had to step in.
Right. Congress eventually moved to formalize things, maybe decentralize it a bit. You got the National Emergencies Act in '76, and then the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act, IEPA, in '77.
IEPA, right. I've heard of that one.
Yeah, IEPA basically legalized using sanctions during peacetime. But, and this is important, only if the president declared a national emergency threatening U.S. interests. So it put some process around it, but the core power was still there.
Interesting. So then after the Cold War, things shifted again with globalization.
Exactly. Globalization meant more international cooperation, or at least the potential for it. And you saw this move towards what they called targeted or smart sanctions.
Smart sanctions, the idea being?
The idea was to get more precise. Instead of these broad embargoes that might hurt ordinary people, you zero in on the financial holdings of, key leaders, regime figures, specific companies, crucial industries. Put the pressure exactly where you want it.
More surgical, less collateral damage, theoretically.
Theoretically, yes. And this is where America's unique position in the global financial system becomes absolutely critical.
You mean the dominance of the U.S. dollar?
The dollar, yes, but also the correspondent banking system, how banks handle transactions for each other globally and, crucially, SWIFT.
SWIFT, right. That's a big global messaging network for banks.
Huge. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It handles, what, over 40 million payment orders a day, totaling trillions of dollars, like over $5 trillion daily.
Incredible numbers.
They really are. And because the U.S. sits at the heart of this system, with the dollar, with the banks, it means U.S. sanctions have real teeth. They can effectively cut targets off from the global market.
How? By denying access to the dollar?
Yeah, denying access to dollars, cutting off those correspondent banking ties, or even working with SWIFT to block their messages. It's essentially like being locked out of the main operating system of the global economy.
That is immense power. Just immense.
It truly is. Which naturally brings us back to that core question of our deep dive. How well does this power actually work? Especially in achieving, the political goals.
Right, because the Treasury Department's sanctions arm, OFAC, they manage, 38 different sanctions programs right now?
That's the number, 38 programs. Yet studies, including that George W. Bush Institute light paper we mentioned, they consistently highlight a need for more effectiveness in achieving political success.
Especially against certain types of countries.
Exactly, especially when you're targeting authoritarian and corrupt countries. That's where the track record gets really murky.
And this is where, like you said, the rubber meets the road. Sanctions, okay, they definitely inhibit a country's ability to manage its economy. That seems undeniable. Trade, investment, paying back debt, it all gets harder.
No doubt about the economic pain, but here's the paradox. For authoritarian regimes, what's the price of getting sanctions lifted? Usually it involves giving up some measure of power or changing fundamental policies.
Which for them is often completely off the table, non-negotiable.
Precisely. So what happens? Often they just resort to strengthening their resolve, they double down on consolidating control, and they get creative finding other ways to make money, alternative sources of revenue, circumventing the sanctions.
Which kind of defeats the whole purpose, politically speaking.
Fundamentally, it undermines the goal of achieving political change. Sometimes it even backfires and helps them solidify their grip. Let's look at some specific cases. They really hammer this point home.
Okay, where should we start? Iran.
Iran's a classic case. Sanctions go way back, but since 1984, the U.S. has layered on 11 new sets of authorities. It started about getting diplomats released, but expanded way beyond that, deterring terrorism, nuclear proliferation, human rights abuses.
And the measures were tough, targeting key sectors.
Oh, yeah. They went after Iran's oil sector, remember. They have the world's third largest oil reserves and key financial institutions, including, crucially, disconnecting major Iranian banks from SWIFT.
Wow, okay, so the economic impact must have been severe.
Immediate and devastating. Trade with the U.S. just collapsed from billions down to like $23 million. Early on, oil exports to the U.S. dropped by maybe $2.5 billion in just 1 year, 1980. Later in 2012, combined EU and U.S. sanctions caused Iran's GDP growth to contract by almost 5%. The economic pain was absolutely undeniable.
But the political goals. Washington wanted to stop the nuclear program, change behavior.
And despite that crushing economic strain, the sanctions failed to achieve Washington's political objectives. That's the key takeaway. Iran kept advancing its uranium enrichment. And what did they do? They looked for other partners, strengthened ties with politically aligned countries, which just complicated things further for the U.S.
So intense pressure, but instead of compliance, it hardened their resolve and pushed them elsewhere.
That's the pattern. Okay, next case. Russia.
Right, especially after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Big, comprehensive sanctions followed that.
Absolutely comprehensive. Removing key Russian banks from SWIFT, blocking something like $300 billion in foreign reserves held abroad, putting a price cap on their oil exports, $60 a barrel, when it usually traded higher. Over 300 Russian targets are under sanctions now.
And the predictions were dire. Economic collapse, right?
That was the initial thinking, yeah. But it didn't quite happen that way. Russia actually showed surprising resiliency and capability to adjust. Now, don't get me wrong, their economy lagged the global average, but it didn't collapse.
And they pushed back.
Oh, yeah. Symbolic countersanctions. But more importantly, they accelerated policies they'd already started, like anti-dollar policies, building much stronger ties with neighbors, especially China.
And critically, politically, did it force them out of Ukraine?
Not at all. The sanctions haven't compelled Russia to withdraw. Instead, they expanded their use of, well, the illegal activity and shadow economy. They famously used a shadow fleet of oil tankers to get around the price caps.
A shadow fleet. Wow.
Yeah. And there's cyber activity against the U.S. and allies. That continues too. Actions as recent as December 2023. So again, economic impact, yes. Achieving the core political objective, no. Deterrence, limited.
Okay, one more case study on sanctions. Venezuela?
Venezuela. Sanctions there started back in 2005, initially linked to drug trafficking and support for Hezbollah. President Obama formalized a program in 2015.
But it was President Trump's maximum pressure campaign that really dialed it up.
That's right, maximum pressure. Freezing assets of the state oil giant, PDVSA, the central bank, the state gold company, even restrictions on ships going in and out.
And the Venezuelan economy. We heard the stories.
Absolutely tanked. Oil exports plummeted down to maybe 558,000 barrels a day by 2021. National debt ballooned to $150 billion. Half the population living in poverty. You had over 8 million Venezuelans flee the country. It's a humanitarian crisis.
Just staggering numbers. Did the economy show any signs of life later?
There was some reported GDP growth recently, like 8% in 2022, maybe 4% in 2023. But context is key. A huge chunk of their economy, maybe 21% of GDP in 2021, was reportedly from illegal operations. And Maduro, meanwhile, kept pushing anti-dollar policies, trying to join alternative banking systems.
And politically, did maximum pressure achieve its goal? Remove Maduro, bring democracy.
The conclusion is pretty stark. The putative measures strained the economy terribly, yes, but they were ultimately incapable of removing the Venezuelan president from power or injecting democratic conditions.
So Maduro is still there, still supporting Hezbollah, ignoring drug trafficking, even threatening neighbors like Guyana.
Still doing all of those things. It's another powerful example. Economic pain, yes. Political change, no. Not the intended change anyway.
So these case studies, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, they really paint a consistent picture, don't they?
They really do. Traditional sanctions, even severe ones, even when they cause significant economic hardship, they often just hit a wall when it comes to forcing major political shifts in determined authoritarian regimes. The lesson seems pretty clear. Relying only on economic pressure often isn't enough. It's an inadequate solution on its own.
Okay, so if sanctions alone are proving inadequate, especially against these tough regimes, what's the alternative? And this brings us right back to the beginning, to these more recent assertive actions by the Trump administration. A different approach.
A very different approach. One that seems to emphasize strength, decisiveness, direct action. And that first example takes us, maybe surprisingly, from global finance to outer space.
Right, the Space Command move.
Exactly. President Trump announces the U.S. Space Force Command is moving, going to Huntsville, Alabama. He even said the city would be renamed Rocket City.
And the stated reason was quite pointed.
Extremely pointed. He explicitly cited Colorado's very corrupt voting system, specifically mail-in voting, and claimed Democrats cheat. Said it was a big factor. Now, whatever you think of the reasoning, using a major strategic military asset relocation, partly based on domestic political grievances, that sends a powerful signal.
A signal about willingness to act decisively, maybe link domestic issues with national strategy?
Perhaps. It signals an administration willing to use all levers, maybe even against domestic opposition. And you have to wonder how allies and adversaries interpret that kind of resolve.
And it reverses a Biden-era decision, promises, what, 30,000 jobs, those billions and billions for Alabama?
Right. A state with deep roots in aerospace and defense. So it demonstrates this willingness to make these big calls based on a mix of strategy, perceived domestic problems, and, rewarding states aligned with national priorities.
Okay, so that's one example. Then there's the military strike, much more direct action.
Much more direct. That's strike in the Caribbean. U.S. military hits a vessel leaving Venezuela out in international waters. President Trump directly linked it to the Tren de Aragua cartel, said it was carrying illegal drugs.
And Secretary Rubio's description was lethal strike.
Lethal strike against a designated narco-terrorist organization. 11 terrorists reported killed, no U.S. casualties. It serves as a very unambiguous notice, doesn't it? A warning against drug trafficking into the U.S.
Now, obviously, critics raised questions. Was the boat really a threat? The legality?
Sure, those questions were raised, but the official line was firm. This is about securing borders, combating narco-terrorism, and using decisive military action when necessary. It fits into that broader war on drugs narrative, but with a very kinetic edge here, a clear projection of strength.
And this projection of strength seems to extend across Latin America.
It certainly seems intended to. The analysis suggests President Trump's approach is seen as a wake-up call to dictators in the region. Think Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia. There's an expectation of consequences for those regimes. They're likely nervous about a shift to a harder U.S. line.
Because the America First policy emphasizes sovereignty, burden sharing.
Right, and the core idea that America must be strong at home to project power abroad. Having Marco Rubio as Secretary of State reinforces that. He's known for a hardline stance against those governments. The expectation is heightened economic and political isolation for them.
And how are other leaders in the region reacting?
Conservative leaders, people like President Milei in Argentina, reportedly have overwhelmingly positive reactions. They seem to be hoping for strong U.S. support to promote democracy and conservative policies in their own countries.
Okay, so projecting strength abroad. What about ensuring order at home? That also seems part of this assertive stance.
Definitely. We saw President Trump deploy National Guard troops to Washington, D.C., the stated goal being to reestablish law, order, and public safety. And he announced similar plans for Chicago, even with local officials objecting.
Right, which brings up legal questions like the Posse Comitatus Act.
Exactly. There was that case where a federal judge ruled a previous deployment in Los Angeles illegal under that act, which generally prohibits using the military for domestic law enforcement.
And the White House reaction was strong.
Very strong pushback. Called the judge rogue, accused them of trying to usurp the authority of the commander-in-chief, and insisted the president had saved Los Angeles. It clearly shows this administration's view. Executive action is paramount for national security and domestic order. The commander-in-chief has the ultimate authority. That's the stance.
Okay, so bringing this all together, we've looked at the limitations of sanctions, these case studies, and now these examples of more direct, assertive action under Trump. What's the big picture here for U.S. foreign policy?
Well, the deep dives, looking at the sanction studies like the Bush Institute paper, and then contrasting that with these recent actions, it really underscores a critical point. Economic pressure, yes, it can inflict tension on a target economy, it causes pain,
Right.
but it only sometimes results in their intended objective when it comes to political change. Often it falls short, especially against determined regimes.
So the source material itself suggests sanctions aren't enough on their own. A recalibration is needed, using them with other tools.
Exactly. The suggestion is using sanctions in tandem with other tools, things like diplomatic isolation, deterrence, and peacekeeping missions. A broader toolkit.
But these recent actions we discussed, the Space Command move, the military strike, they seem to point towards a different kind of recalibration, right? A shift towards a more muscular, America First approach.
It certainly looks that way, prioritizing immediate decisive action. It signals a belief, perhaps, that you need to demonstrate strength directly, that strength at home enables that kind of strength abroad, and maybe that direct action, even if it carries higher risks, is seen as more effective, more immediate in achieving specific national security goals, particularly against adversaries who just won't bend to economic pressure alone.
So as the U.S. continues to face these global challenges, rivals like Russia and China, transnational crime, terrorism, the big question remains, what's the right mix? How much economic leverage, how much direct action will best protect American interests and promote stability?
And maybe just as importantly, what new challenges, what new dynamics might this bolder, more assertive approach create down the road? That's certainly something to think about.
It's definitely something for all of us to consider.